The next software development lifecycle that we're going to cover is the spiral model. So the spiral model is aptly named. It is a combination of both linear and iterative. Linear because it goes through the same steps every iteration. And iterative because obviously it goes through these steps multiple times. So very similar to the incremental approach, but there are some key differences with the spiral model, which is the reason that it was developed and created. The big difference with the spiral model is it focuses heavily on risk assessment and risk management. So this is great for projects that have high risk. They could be dealing with governments or with regulations where there's a high risk, or even the healthcare industry where there's a high risk to the project, and we need to make sure that the risks are being assessed multiple times throughout the project, identifying and mitigating those risks. So one way that this model reduces some of those risks is by breaking up the project into multiple segments. So working through it in a more iterative fashion rather than a strict waterfall approach helps to identify and mitigate risks at a smaller level rather than having a huge risk that could derail the whole project. So each cycle, we'll kind of get into a little bit more in the next slide, but each cycle begins with identifying stakeholders and identifying what success looks like. So that's a little bit unique because most of the time identifying stakeholders and what success looks like is one of the first steps to a project, and that maybe gets touched on as you work back through an iteration. But the spiral model kind of redoes the whole thing. They make sure we have the right stakeholders in play and we have the right success metrics and the business problem identified as to what we're moving forward. And they set kind of a mini goal for that particular spiral as to what the commitments are and how that's going to look. And then the each cycle, as I kind of just alluded to, it ends with a review and a commitment after that cycle. So this is the spiral model. A little confusing to look at, but we're going to go through it in detail to try to help explain it out. You actually start right inside of here, so right here. And the first thing you're doing is you're determining the objectives of the project, which is a key first step. Understanding what that business need is, what those user needs are. So you're starting right there, and then you're working into this small little piece here. So you skip over and you're doing a concept of requirements. You're understanding what those requirements would look like. Throwing kind of the concepts together of what business need is this solving. You work through the concept of operation. What will it look like for us to utilize this particular software application? Who's going to be the users and how's that going to look? And then you work into creating a requirements plan. So you do that, and now you're getting into your kind of first full cycle through. So after you've created the requirements plan, you're doing a risk analysis. So now you're identifying and solving risks. It's very important that you don't actually get into the prototype until that risk analysis is complete. You want to understand what those risks are to the project and mitigate those risks. So maybe the risks are that the particular software application you're creating will go in some type of healthcare machine, and one risk analysis is making sure that that has a fail-safe, that it can't fail and accidentally pump additional blood or additional fluids into the person that's hooked up to the machine. So you're doing kind of initial risk analysis and saying, okay, we need to identify and mitigate that and make sure that that's in play. And then one of the other unique things with this is you're going in and you're creating your prototype 1. So you're going in and actually doing some pieces and creating a very, very, very rough prototype. This isn't going to be one that's done within code. This is more going to be one that's done kind of written, drawn, something like that. This is going to be a rough sketch, a rough idea of what the software is going to look like. You then are working through and defining what all those requirements are. So at this point, as you create your first prototype, you don't know really that much about the requirements. You kind of have a requirements plan and an idea of the concept of it, and you're creating that prototype 1 just to validate it. So then you're coming through your requirements, and then you're verifying and validating your requirements, and then you're creating a development plan. So this is kind of the key thing here. You're actually starting to say, okay, we need to be ready to develop this now, and we need to do the coding necessary to make this happen. You also are finishing as you finish that development plan, you're coming up to the review point. So this is where you're re-identifying stakeholders. You're putting the project under review to make sure that the business objectives that were originally identified and the business needs are being solved for. So you go back through here, you create your review, you're redoing your objectives, and then you're working through the second piece of the spiral. You're again doing risk analysis, identifying those risks, mitigating the risks. And as you kind of work through each particular spiral, one thing to look at is the spiral, the length of time gets longer. So you're going to identify more risks now that you have a better understanding of what those requirements are. Now you're going to get into the prototype. So this is where you're actually going to probably do a little bit of coding, a little bit of configuration, and work through that now that you've got a good development plan and start that piece. You're then going to do a draft and work through the development of the actual product. So this is where the mainstay of development happens, and you're working through all of the requirements that were defined. You then are verifying and validating all of those requirements. As you get here, now you're getting into kind of planning that next iteration, which you need to plan for the testing phase. So you're finishing up your development, and now you're working into plan for your testing phase. Again, you come to the review, you're re-identifying stakeholders, ensuring that you have the right people engaged, and you're planning that next, and looking at the business need, and you're planning that next iteration through the spiral. You're coming up, again, determining the objectives, making progress through here, and then you're identifying solving risks. And now this prototype that you're utilizing or that you're creating is actually an operational prototype, meaning that it's one that could be utilized and it is almost the end result of the product. Then you're working through detailed design, you're doing more coding, integration, testing, implementation, and then you're finally releasing. So the one key thing is this spiral continues on and on to work through your detailed design and to work through your coding and your integration. So you may have a very tight spiral where you're working through it, but each key spiral as you're working through a set of basically the waterfall stages that you work through, which is your requirements, your design, your implementation, your testing, your deployment, your maintenance. And that's really what the spiral is doing, but it's doing it in a way that you're working through, you're identifying risk, creating a prototype, and then moving on to that next phase. So some pros and cons to the spiral model. One of the pros is it does a really good job managing risks and mitigating risk. And we talked about that a lot. You're identifying it multiple times throughout the project. You're mitigating it multiple times throughout the project. So as you've put more emphasis on it, you're obviously going to make it easier to mitigate and to manage those risks. Another thing is you're able to identify issues earlier. So as you're working through the spiral, re-identifying stakeholders, re-identifying the business need, you can make sure that you're on the right track. And also you're able to identify those risks and you're able to find those problems and those issues earlier in the project, which saves you a lot of time and money later on. You don't want them coming up as you're finishing up the project. The next thing is, as you're working through the spiral, your estimates as you're getting into development are going to be really good. You've done a lot of work to get up to that point, to work through your requirements in your design and your planning. So your estimates towards the end on how many more hours, man hours, or schedule time that's going to take is going to be pretty good. And then the next thing is you get developers engaged very early in this type of model. So you don't have business analysts that are gathering the requirements and trying to create a solution and kind of maybe reaching a little bit out of their expertise zone to work through designing the solution. You have developers early in the project. They have got experience. They know what they've developed in the past. They know what's worked and what hasn't. So having them engaged early helps to avoid some of those problems and make sure that the design that was identified and that was come up with is a successful one. Some of the cons to the spiral model. As you can imagine, this is a long time to get a finished product. you're creating prototypes, but they're not really something that can be utilized. So it is a long time. You're working through a lot of spirals to get there. So imagine the waterfall methodology and now kind of expanding that even further in this spiral model, because you're having to put a risk identification, mitigation in there on every time you move to the next stage, as well as reviewing stakeholders and business plans and planning for that next stage. So there's a lot of additional time that gets put into this particular model. And with that, there's a high cost. I mean, obviously with more time, more resources, a higher cost to utilize this model. Another thing is it relies really heavily on special skills of somebody that's is able to identify and mitigate risks. So having just a normal project team try to do this, that kind of identifying, mitigating risks, isn't going to be something that's done very well if they're not used to doing that. So you need some type of person that's been in risk management and that's been in these projects that have failed or been very similar, and they do a good job. They know kind of what steps it takes to identify and mitigate those risks. And then the other thing that happens is, because you're working through and kind of building this from the ground up, the solution ends up usually being extremely custom. And by making it very custom, the requirements that you're identifying, that you're documenting, that you're creating, and the design that you're putting together has a very limited chance of being able to be reused on future projects. So kind of the model's not only high cost, but it also makes you have to, dump all that work that you've done, and it's really just only can be utilized and realized in this particular application. So when should you use the spiral model? So one big thing is, and kind of goes without saying, is when risk identification and mitigation are high, and when that's very important to the project. You want it to use in medium and high risk projects, ones that have huge issues if you don't identify and correct for that risk as part of the project. Another thing is users that aren't sure of their needs. So this kind of goes with most iterative type of projects, is you don't have to identify all the requirements up front. As you kind of work through your spirals, you're able to identify them and kind of utilize them as you go. Another one is if you need prototypes. So if you're maybe selling this product and you need to be able to get constant feedback from outside users, prototypes are very helpful to do that and to give something tangible, have somebody utilize it. And there's other reasons that prototypes are very useful, and this type of model does a good job to create those prototypes as you work through. Another reason is if requirements are complex. So you're working through a spiral model, you've got more time to work through it, and you've got designated sections where you're able to solve for some of those complexities. Time and cost aren't as important, since it's going to be high cost, long time. You obviously don't want to be utilizing this when the business needs something tangible in their hands right away, and they need to be realizing the benefit, or they have a very limited budget. And then last but not least is the little to no experience in the project area. So since you're designating so much time to working through it, if you don't have a lot of experience in the project area, it's not going to affect you as much, because you're able to work and spend a great deal of time getting that experience, getting that knowledge, and doing your necessary research. So that's the spiral model. Definitely useful. It's utilized in high risk situations, but not as utilized in a lot of industries compared to some of the other models.